Okay, if we're all sitting comfortably, my name's Greg Anderson. I'm with John Brooke, one of the co-directors of this this two-year program on states in history. And just to give you a heads up about the format here, Cliff has pre-circulated the paper, which I hope you've had a chance to look at. So he won't be giving a formal delivery of it, but he'll be giving us his sort of general, I guess, condensed version of it in what follows. And then Anthony Caldelis, our very distinguished colleague from the Classics Department, who is also has an appointment in history, will be commenting on that paper, and from there we'll throw it open to wider discussion. I think there's plenty of red meat here for us to talk about. So that's the format. Anyway, I'm delighted to be able to welcome Cliff Ando to our humble institution. And he comes to us originally from Princeton, where he did a BA in Classics back in 1990. He then did his PhD at Michigan in Classical Studies. First job was at York University, that slightly radical, sprawling commuter campus in Greater Toronto. From there he moved to USC, and there ultimately to the University of Chicago, where he's been teaching since, I believe, 2006. He is currently the David B. and Clara E. Stern Professor. It's not a professor of anything in particular, it's just the Stern Professor. And he is also professor of Classics, History and Law, and co-director of the Center for the Study of Ancient Religions. He is also a research fellow in the Department of Classics and World Languages at the University of South Africa, which I've just heard has 600,000 students. And he has won numerous fellowships and held numerous visiting positions of one kind or another at just about every North American and European university you've ever heard of. So I certainly won't list them. He's best known for his work on Roman imperial governance, and I think particularly known for his theoretically adventurous, methodologically innovative approaches to that large topic. Probably best known for two books, Imperial Ideology and Provincial Loyalty in the Roman Empire, published by California back in 2000, and more recently, Law, Language and Empire in the Roman Tradition, published in 2011. A particular favourite of mine also is The Matter of the Gods, published also by California in 2008, and we are promised a book called Roman Social Imaginaries, which should be coming out fairly soon from Toronto Press. It's actually the Robson Lectures, which Cliff gave recently in published form. And then, even more intriguing, The Holy Man and His Holy Fools. We do away with that one. University of California Press will be releasing that before too long. But today, Cliff is going to talk to us, I guess, in an area closer to the main thrust of his inquiries over the last couple of decades, namely Roman imperial governance. And the title of his talk and paper is The Ambitions of Government, Territoriality and Infrastructural Power in Ancient Rome. So with that, Cliff Ando.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thanks also to John for the invitation and the hospitality. So I'm not entirely sure how much to say in light of the fact that the paper was pre-circulated. So let me just say a word about the project to which this paper or these thoughts are intended ultimately to contribute. And then at the end of the paper, at the end of the pre-circulated paper, I promised that I would show you some maps to illustrate, to discuss around which to discuss a case study of something that a case study of the phenomenon that I'm discussing, and I got the maps from the University of North Carolina's Ancient World Mapping Center yesterday. This is obviously not North Africa, but I'll explain in a second why I'm showing this one. Where's the clicker? How do I change from slide to slide?
That's a good question.
It's way over there. Okay.
Grab the keyboard and pull it all
Looks
down.
like it's the lights.
Yeah.
Where's the clicker?
That's just a lid.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, the whole keyboard will move because it's on a very long cord.
You can see how adept I am with PowerPoint that I had managed to get the thing up there without a clue about how to change from one to the other. I've only ever done one slide PowerPoint, sure.
Amazing.
So I I might describe the current, this project in two ways. One is sort of biographical and one is historiographic. The biographical explanation is the first book that I wrote, which Greg mentioned, called Imperial Ideology and Provincial Loyalty in the Roman Empire, essentially discussed the process of political and cultural change in the provinces of the Roman Empire as a product of something like communicative exchange between center and periphery. And inter alia, it made an aggressive claim for something like the sort of Habermasian rationality of that conversation. I suggested that one of the things that Roman government did, in part because Roman government, or no, any ancient government, perhaps no modern government, is actually powerful enough to govern its population, as many have observed, because the governors are always fewer than the governed, that the Roman government, in issuing commands or suggestions or issuing mandates to local populations, advanced a series of what we might call legitimacy claims embedded in its instructions, which the populations that received these could demand that the Roman government vindicate. But as a result of this conversation, not only did Roman government come to organize itself around various kinds of principles of bureaucratic rationality, or so I claimed, so as a long-term effect of this conversation, so provincial, or what we might call colonized populations, came to accept the legitimacy of Roman government over them. May or may not be true, but this was my characterization of an exceedingly long-term process. Around the time I was finishing that book, an acquaintance of mine asked me if I would write a chapter for what was then the sort of new genre of the companion. Right? This was the companion to the Roman Empire. I said, would I write the chapter on the administration of the provinces, Roman governance over colonized populations, to use contemporary terminology. And I had to confess, when this invitation came in, I was somewhat too embarrassed to say I didn't really know anything about the Roman provinces. Wasn't it all just about, democratic discourse or something like this? I mean, wasn't it just a matter of letters and communications going back and forth? And I didn't know anything about jurisdiction or taxation or any policing, for God's sake. So I accepted this invitation by way of sort of it struck me as some sort of karmic moral scourge that I should now educate myself in the actual structures of Roman government. And in doing so, I wrote this chapter, but I also came to see that it would be possible to tell something like, or I thought it would be possible to tell, a story very much like the first one that I had told, using wildly different evidence. In fact, I imagined making this sort of formal joke and then see if anybody would notice, maybe Anthony would, that I'd written another big book about exactly the same time period and cited exactly none of the same sources. I haven't tested this yet, now I've told Anthony about it, but I might try to pull this off. In any event, I got sort of sidetracked and went and wrote some other things in the meantime, in part because the story turned out to be difficult to tell. That's true for two reasons. One is, as you probably already have a sense, and this is true both of my project, but many others involving antiquity, that the evidence is hard to aggregate. Part of the project involves writing a tale about the demographic reorganization of populations, essentially Romans persuading people to come out of the hills and live on the plains. But producing a catalog of occasions when the Romans told people to come out of the hills and live on the plains involves not simply finding all the instances, or some instances when this occurred, but in fact showing that in some cases what we know of is at more or less the same time a city came into existence in some river valley, and at the same time it looks like a wooden town up on top of a mountainside was burned down or systematically disassembled. That is, we don't have a written record of this. What we have is a material record in which the chronology of causation is unclear. And vindicating a claim that these two events have something to do with one another is not necessarily easy. And this process is reduplicated. I have a database of some 170 occasions in which I think this happened. So it's non-negligible sum, but whether in fact this turns out to persuade anyone, I don't know. So that's the one problem. And the other, which bears more directly on stuff that I discuss in the paper that I pre-circulated, is that I take it I think this is more or less true, or at least was true until perhaps at least 10 years ago, that the dominant models of ancient government then available in Roman studies took Roman government for various reasons to be essentially reactionary. That the Romans had, acquired an empire more or less by accident. They had intended it merely to be used for the extraction of revenues. They, at best, surrendered control at a local level over to elites, to whom they came eventually to co-opt into the project of governance, and so on and so forth. And that the primary evidence, all of these claims rested on, these interpretive claims rested on a series of smaller claims about the evidence. That, for instance, the Romans never described themselves, or almost never described themselves, as having an imperial project, like one of conversion or cultural transformation. And as a secondary and perhaps more serious matter, virtually all the evidence that we have of, as it were, specific actions of Roman government are documents that arise out of interactions between provincials and Romans in which the, as it were, motivation for the interaction arises from below. That is, they're inscribed or documentary records of petitions filed by members of colonized or provincial populations who write to Roman governors or Roman emperors and ask for something. And that if you were to aggregate these and ask yourselves, where is the evidence in all of this for a policy designed from above and imposed, especially a policy imposed universally, the answer is we have almost none. Virtually every, say, specific action we know the Roman government undertaken looks like it was taken in reaction to some petition from below. The result has been a picture of something like the Roman Empire that is, to speak in gender terms, emasculated, it's abortive. The one thing I think it ultimately cannot do is to explain something like the material evidence of empire that now confronts us. Because if you were in fact, that is the same evidence that caused people like, say, Edward Gibbon and Enlightenment historians leading up through something like Victorian historians of the Roman Empire in, say, 1910s England and just before, the material evidence we have from all over the Roman Empire, which is astonishingly uniform in its architectural and material forms, which suggests, in fact, that Roman government was wildly successful, both in universalizing something like a metropolitan culture and in something like the depth of penetration that they achieved. So on the one hand, the title of the project, The Ambitions of Government, is intended as a riposte to something like 25 years or so of history that depicts Roman government in these terms. That said, it has an additional ambition, which brings us directly to this paper, which I'll discuss now for just a second, which is that I do think, however, that that we risk being misled in the same way that, say, earlier Europeans on a grand tour were misled by focusing overly much on the remains of Greco-Roman cities, or for that matter, on the cultural production of elites who resided in Greco-Roman cities. Because the simple fact of the matter is that something on the order of 85% of the population, at least, lived outside what we would now call, and what the Romans in documents classified as cities. So then the question arises, particularly given, one, the bias that archaeological science has had, at least in the Mediterranean basin, towards the excavation of cities, and B, the tendency of cultural production in antiquity to have been located in cities. What capacity do we have at an evidentiary basis, or what kind of hermeneutic models do we have to deploy on ancient evidence that might allow us access to the other 85% of the population, and to assess the question whether Roman government, ancient government, reached these people at all. And so in the paper that I pre-circulated, I sketch out two different means of getting at this, each of which then entails, I mean, I'll describe them quickly, but each of which entails a whole series of other methodological and evidentiary problems that I won't go into. The first topic that I discuss is the problem of attribution, what the Romans call attribution, which you might translate as the administrative subordination of rural populations to urban centers. That is to say, to what extent did Romans imagine and then develop mechanisms to promote the dependence of rural populations on cities for, to speak about in terms of like modern agglomeration theory, to supply services to the rural population. If you approach the problem through a certain kind of economic history, stretching from Polanyi through Moses Finley and so on, we think of ancient cities as consumer cities that were essentially parasitic upon the economic production of rural areas. This kind of thought did exist in antiquity, but actually, as it turns out, it's an interesting feature, given what an extraordinary historian he was, how much Finley ignores this. There is actually an ancient literature on the relationship of cities to rural populations, and it works the other way around. It depicts cities as providing services to rural populations, and the one on which I concentrate is the provision of legal services to rural population. And I then very quickly, having described to you some of the ways in which these relations are discussed in the paper, in particular by reference to an ancient catalog of cities that then specifies what rural populations are dependent on those cities, I then discuss briefly some of the minor literary allusions we have to the acculturative effects of city-hinterland interaction in respect to Roman and non-Roman populations. And the second phenomenon that I discuss is has to do with the elaboration of, quite literally, infrastructure. I try to turn my attention to what is it? It must be one of the most conventional topics in Roman history, that is to say, the building of roads. All roads leading to Rome, which is something the Romans themselves said, and in many ways designed the road system to instantiate. It's not just a conceit. I spend a little bit of time lamenting the fact that for all that ancient historians post-Moses Finley are used to worrying about things like speed of transportation, cost of transportation, and economic issues, they've spent less time than you might have thought discussing problems of cultural change and the movement of cultural fashions along particular, what I call metaphorically, highways. To what extent can we map things like, there actually is a sophisticated, very minor literature, which even the ancient historians may not have paid any attention to, for the spread of nicknames in the Roman world. That become, say, popular in the Italian peninsula, and then we see about a generation later picked up in the port cities of Spain, and about a generation later picked up in the Spanish hinterland, for example. The obvious case where this could be mapped well, and which has sort of been done and sort of not been done, and I give you various examples reproduced badly in the paper, is conversion rates, where we think we know, we probably do kind of know on the basis of tombstones, the publicly avowed religious affiliation of various decedents, and we could then, to the extent that we can date these tombstones, you could then hopefully show, I think you can show, or you could show if people had tried to show, that diasporic religions spread first to port cities, and then as a secondary matter to smaller port cities via cabotage, and then up river valleys, and then along paved roads, and then finally along dirt roads. This being a reason why, as many of you may know, why we call pagans pagans, which just means a resident of the countryside, because that is the last place that Christianity managed to reach. And frankly, to be perfectly honest, Tina and I could disagree. I don't think Christianity had any interest in converting the countryside. The people were poor and illiterate. And efforts at conversion were primarily directed at the rich. That's an avowed policy of the church, but it's not a topic of the paper. It's just no, but it's true.
pretty sorry if Aral might disagree, but I think it's effective.
So, what I thought, at the end of the paper, I'd say that I'm going to talk briefly about a set of maps about North Africa, and let me just talk about two examples quickly now, because I happen to have on my computer a different set of, these are maps that I obtained from this outfit in North Carolina called the Ancient World Mapping Center, which was a byproduct of Richard Tolbert's efforts to map the ancient world. And unfortunately, the first two maps I'm going to show you, which are of the Po Valley, are beautifully legible, and the next two are not so. And it has something to do with some, I got some weird explanation from them about blah, 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 and grayscale and contours, and I didn't even understand. All I know is that the maps that I wanted to show you will be less clear than these. So I'm going to start in northern Italy, even though I didn't intend to. Even though this is an attempt to show the world before Rome, and of course it's also from a colonialist perspective, because the built features of the landscape that the Ancient World Mapping Center mapped are primarily those that the Greeks and Romans built. So if you write to the Ancient World Mapping Center and say, please remove the Greek and Roman built features, what you get is nothing, because the world didn't really exist before. I'm just going to show you this one very, very quickly, and then I'll actually say just a few more words about North Africa. This is the Po Valley about 200 years later, right? With a set of highways that bound the plain, although this is not really all plain, but I won't go into that. Roads, paved roads linking a set of cities, including here, here, and here, Roman colonies, and since one of the things that I sent along by way of suggested reading, but many people already read it anyhow, Jim Scott's Seeing Like a State, the bits in gray, which are actually beautifully rendered on the digital version, are the areas of Roman cadastration, where the Romans inscribed in the landscape a cadastral grid. And as I discussed earlier today over lunch, a Roman cadastral grid was so heavily inscribed in the land with ditches lined with stones that several tens of thousands of hectares of Roman cadastration can still be seen from the air 2,000 years later. That's how we know they were there. So let me just move ahead to North Africa, which sort of like res nullius, right? Obviously, there were no people here before the Romans came along, except. There were. So I asked them to mark out a couple of the cities that they were, certainly Carthage. And not that it's a major city, but that's Hippo, so it's Augustine's town, so people are likely to know it anyhow. But what I wanted to illustrate here, and the mountainous area is just sort of rendered now as sort of blur, so it's hard to see. But there were, as anybody who's ever studied state formation knows, in this sort of mountainous area, all the dark area, lived peoples who were exceedingly difficult to control. Hell, they're difficult for states nowadays to control, but they were certainly difficult in antiquity. And what I wanted to discuss, and what I'll at least tell you about, even though I can't show you other than by gesturing at the moment, is that the Romans engaged in a quite remarkable effort to surround these people with, in essence, the infrastructure of the Roman state, with a further set of consequences important. I mean, that much is simple. So a set of walls down here, occasionally heading peoples in, and roads. There's actually a road here, but its path is conjectural, so they didn't put it in. And roads here on the bottom of the mountains, and then roads here on the top of the mountains, and they gradually then built 3 road systems passing through, and then inside the mountainous areas, anywhere where it was flat enough, as you can see, they then carved up the land suitable to cereal agriculture. They imposed a cadastral grid on it and encouraged either Romans to go settle there or encouraged people to come out of the hills and live in Roman-style dwellings there. And what is particularly interesting, given the sort of thrust that I give to the paper, that is to say that what I see happening in the process of the Romans encouraging others, in essence, to take over the upkeep of infrastructure, and that this produces a kind of institutional mimesis inside the governmental structures of these subordinate communities, is that about 100 years after the Romans start building this set of roads surrounding the mountains, about 100 years after, you begin to find people with citizen names with indigenous patronymics. So they're indigenous populations that have become Roman citizens, taking over the process I mean, actually, of maintenance of the highway. I mean, sort of like, you know, driving on I-94 and seeing, you know, the sort of sign, so-and-so's Dunkin' Donuts is responsible for cleaning this 100 meters or whatever. I mean, it's actually more or less like that. And you begin to find that with indigenous names. It takes about 100 years. But they change to Latin names. As I say, a couple of them have indigenous patronymics, and you see that, and that they will occasionally declare themselves with titles like, you know, the praefectus Mussolaniarum, so that the prefect, they use a Roman title as the person in charge, put in charge of their people. So the elaboration of something like the material infrastructure of the state becomes not simply a physical means of intruding into the landscape, but it brings along with it a set of pressures that produce institutional changes that occur or that cause systems of local self-governance to exist in something like a relation, I think, both of institutional homeomorphy, but frankly also ideological homology with the structures of the Roman state, to put it in rather elaborate language. So, there you go. Anthony.
Well, I thought I would make some remarks, bring in some additional issues, and these are issues that I encountered or had to face when I began to wonder about the basically the sequel of everything that Cliff has described, which is my area, which is the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is a continuation of all of these processes, and it is you can think of it as yet another way to test these and see where they're all going. So these are, you know, specific models for testing the extent of penetration of Roman modes of governance into populations, and they take a century or so. But suppose you have 10 of them, 10 centuries, I mean, and you can see exactly how those work out in the long term. Now there I encountered a kind of problem, which was that the more I thought about what Byzantium actually was, the less satisfied I was with the terminology that we use to describe it, and the theoretical apparatus that comes along with that terminology. And around the time that imperial ideology came out, I was beginning to sort of come out myself in wondering whether what we call the Byzantine Empire is an empire at all, and whether that term actually fits, and maybe we should be using a term like state or something like that. But there wasn't very much theoretical literature that was helpful. And so what I want to identify is some sort of disciplinary methodological gaps that are very, very difficult to bridge. And that, for example, when you start to look into modern theories about states and empires and so on, especially the state, which is mostly theorized as a modern entity, you will find a kind of fiction for the origins of the state. And you will usually see some sort of introductory, you know, well, the pre-modern state is often called a personal patrimonial state, and it's a medieval ancient thing. And we're not going to worry about that because things get interesting, you know, around the time when Hobbes comes along to discuss it, or a little bit before that. And so the medieval state is kind of treated as sort of the property of the king or something like that. It's not a very theorized, you know, state entity. It doesn't have any claims on a theoretical model from us. And clearly this type of theory, however useful it is for understanding the origin of modern concepts of the state, doesn't help understand most pre-modern states, and many medievalists and so on have reacted against this. On the other hand, many ancient historians, and certainly most Byzantinists, do not have a theoretical apparatus for discussing these terms. They're mostly empirically based historians, and they have not looked at these terms. And I'll give you an example, citing also the book that Cliff mentioned by Scott, which Seeing Like a State. And there's an interesting little paradox in that book that recurs. And of course, this is I don't know if you've noticed this, wherever he mentions Romans. So this is a book about how the modern state you know, views its territories and its peoples and its apparatus and organizes them in these sort of hyper-efficient ways that prove dysfunctional. And in order to develop the model of how the modern state is doing this, and he also refers to the pre-modern patrimonial state as something that, well, didn't really do this. It was purely empirical, rulers just dealt with local elites, and you know, so long as it worked, it was good enough. But when he wants to sometimes give metaphors for just how, you know, rationally planned modern states are to this like extreme, he'll cite the Romans as a kind of model for this, like Roman camps and Roman roads and so on. And you begin to wonder, wait, you don't have a model for that. I mean, so this is outside your narrative history, the fiction. It's just outside the fiction altogether. Anyway, so there are very, very few people I have found who combine the study of modern theory with the ancient or medieval evidence. Very, very few. Greg Anderson is one right there. It's a very, very useful article on ancient Athenian views about this. And how do you get our theories about what a state is to align with the ancient evidence? So what I'm just going to do two more things. I'm going to read to you two quotations about the Byzantine state / empire / whatever we want to call it, that I think perfectly capture the sheer mess that the field is in. And I don't think it's just Byzantine studies. You find this in medieval studies all the time, and I'm sure in antiquity as well, when you actually ask people, so what do you think the Roman Empire was? And you get all kinds of things. And so I'm going to read these two quotations, which are very precisely formulated. So on the one hand, the Byzantine bureaucratic system was not an anonymous, independent, and self-regulating administrative structure, but a patrimonial network of concentric circles of clientage and patronage concentrated around the imperial court and, more importantly, around the person of the emperors. Okay? So, patrimonial. Quotation number 2. The government and the court, this is about Byzantium, in spite of often dramatic transfers of political power from ruler to ruler and their supporting factions and vested interests, remained stable and continued to function. A standing army was maintained through an administrative apparatus whose resources were independent of the imperial household. Even in the worst of crises, when an emperor was killed in battle, the state was hardly shaken. The state's fiscal and administrative machinery was kept running with barely a murmur of unease. Institutional stability of this sort was deeply rooted, and the state and its apparatus were embedded in the social political order. Those are from the same book. Okay. Now, about the 85%. So this is, and I've been collecting in the documents, information, and theories, trying to make sense of all of this. How do we get to the 85% that Cliff has mentioned? And there are a number of ways. Once you begin to look at Byzantium, it actually is the sequel of all of these processes. It was produced by them. Also the later Roman Empire. And the interesting body of evidence that we can use to access this kind of relationship and how the 85% were, as Cliff puts it, interpolated into this state structure is taxation. Because all of these roads and lands, the roads led to lands, the lands were taxed. And the primary concern of the late Roman and Byzantine states was to tax things very efficiently. This is more taxation than in the earlier Roman Empire. And so I've been collecting information about just how deeply the taxman penetrates into the Byzantine self-consciousness. And the tax collectors show up everywhere, in hagiography. The saint goes off onto a mountaintop to be alone from people. The taxman. So there's this concern about, and this body of evidence, for me, acts as a counterweight to certain notions that you will find repeatedly in books on medieval history, including Byzantium. And that is the idea that the vast majority of the population were sort of peasants who basically have no identity in relation to these kinds of state or state-like entities that we discuss. They have no identity. In other words, when some other people or state or quasi-state come along and sort of conquer them, they're indifferent to this. They don't have any kind of personal or other affiliation with a particular state to care enough. What they care about is whether their tax is going to be high or lower. But this happens repeatedly in scholarship, that we're told the vast majority of the population simply did not care so long as certain material concerns were met. In other words, the 85% are basically theorized as identityless and limited to material concerns. Whereas in fact I find this is just simply not the case. They were totally integrated into the mechanisms of the Roman government as it worked in Byzantine times. And I've had debates about this with colleagues who believe that there are these isolated Anatolian peasants in Asia Minor. And this phrase keeps recurring, and I don't know where it's come from. The isolated Anatolian peasants. And I don't think that there was anyone isolated from the structures of government. Certainly not 1,000 years, into this process, which produced some dramatic results. And it's not just Christianization. That's an obvious way to, to track certain types of integration that take place, but there are others, and in late antiquity they accelerate, in fact. So this is a set of concerns that I've had as I'm trying to correlate theoretical models that were not developed to understand ancient medieval societies with the evidence that we have, which is not very good, but I don't think it points in the direction of the personal patrimonial state, in my view. Anyway, so I just throw those out and
Cliff, do you feel like responding to specifically to answer these things, or would you be happy for the masses to show
I mean, there's stuff I could say about the intensification of late antiquity, but I can just let it go.
I thought the paper was great, and I really liked. I see the argument really clearly. What I don't see is the narrative, in the sense that your sources kind of bounce around chronologically. And so, is there a narrative? And if so, where does late antiquity? I mean, it does seem to be this. I mean, I really expected this to end with Diocletian, or at the very least, and then move forward when you have this extraordinary Annona system that does exactly what you're talking about, and is massive amounts of energy on all different levels put into maintaining it.
A couple of quick thoughts. The problem of narrative, or you might say the problem of chronology, is one that you face writing this kind of ancient history. I'm not sure I have a good solution. I tried it, 15 years ago, and I think I had a good solution then. Then I'd have to say the problem of writing a history of this kind of the High Roman Empire, like the first one I wrote, is that it was really a history of something like stability. It's not clear. I mean, I'm totally serious that it's not actually clear. It was not clear to me then. I'm still not sure it's clear to me now what sort of form is appropriate to the narration of stability.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
In this case, right, you have two other difficulties. One is that the processes that I'm trying to describe take place at different parts of the empire at different times, right? So you could write a history of the movement of Ligurian populations out of the hills down into the valleys in the 170s, and a similar narration for similar movements of people in either Cilicia or northern Spain that occurs in the Flavian period 200 years later. And so what you're really talking about is the sort of iterated instantiation of processes that occur wildly different moments of time at different parts of the empire. And exactly how to solve that is one. And then of course it's not simply that the Romans came into control of these areas in different times, but of course that the documentary record that we have is, or the evidentiary record is so fragmentary, right? So the early parts of the story, something like Roman procedures in the immediate post-conquest period are in part dependent upon when the post-conquest period was in any given place, and to iterate, because in fact ancient narrative, ancient historiography focused on conquest, we basically don't have narratives of the post-conquest period. So you immediately, you have fantastic narratives on the part of Tacitus or whoever about the destruction of some town, and then the narrative shifts to the next place the Romans had a battle. You follow the army out of town to the next place the army goes. The narrative of the imposition of the census is, we have a couple of literary references, but they're very unhelpful. As regards intensification in late antiquity, sure, right? I mean, Anthony says the process is slow, and it's absolutely true. That has something to do with the speed of communication and the speeds of transport and so on. There's another feature to what occurs in late antiquity that goes alongside alongside taxation, which is at some level more intensive, but it has to do with Christianization, right? Because there were at least some administrative enterprises that took place in respect of the countryside in antiquity that, so far as one can tell, where Roman interests essentially devolved to the level of the town, and then left it up to the town to see how to put this into action, right? And what you find all of a sudden at the end of the 4th century, and it particularly applies to conversion, right, is there, like the census, was another moment where the state was actually interested in every single damn individual. Right? And so the state begins to impose requirements on landowners that landowners forcibly convert their peasants. And so you see in some of those bits of legislation an acknowledgement on the part of the state of where state infrastructural capacity ended, was with the major North African landowner. And that after that, private forms of what we might call private forms of social dependency are co-opted in the service of state interest, which happens to be church interest. But that would be another moment of intensification, is the forcible conversion of peasants at the end in the 390s, which is to one side of your example of taxation, but it goes alongside with the 4th century at different ways in the start of the 4th century and in a different way at the end of the 4th century both represent a moment of intensification of state interest in the individual.
So a couple of comments. For Anthony, how do you respond to that letter by Synesius that says that where he lives, literally no one cares about what's happening in the empire. No one's connected in any way to, I mean, it's all rhetoric.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters is the tax man, right? I mean,
And he says if you ask them who's the emperor, they say Agamemnon, right?
I mean, it's all rhetoric, though. You know, remember that study that I did years ago on the fee schedule for the courts, right? And essentially,
yeah.
almost the entire countryside, the average person would have been completely priced out of the entire legal system in places like Timgad in Northern Africa, in fact, right? So, I mean, in that sense, it does sort of define part of the narrative, right? I mean, perhaps there was some, there was the government that went around on the circuit, on one hand, high impact, and then later on it seems like people begin to be pushed out more and more, perhaps than they had been before, right? I mean, I guess the average cost for someone to bring a case would have been 2 years worth of income for the average person. It seems like a lot of people are being excluded from the system.
The change in access to courts in late antiquity is a profound problem. But in the early empire, there was no fee. Right, exactly. And so we do have, and not only do we have some small number of records of the number of people who showed up at a Roman court, because just for the sake of you, when we looked at these, what we have occasionally are fragmentary, in essence, copies of petitions where you submit a petition to a court. And what we have is either the copy that was handed back, so they wrote on it, yes, received, and gave it back to you with a ticket number on it, or we occasionally have what appears to be the version that was handed in which a ticket number was written in. And in the case of one of these, we have 2 of these, and they each 2 appear to have come from 3-day assizes by the governors. He made a circuit around the province of Egypt, and one is 2200 and one is 1709. So, and this is before the Antonine Constitution. So these are primarily non-Romans coming to a Roman court. And hundreds upon hundreds of them are showing up for a 3-day court period. So that the worldview, I mean, the late antique world as regards access to courts is a very different world, not least among other things because of the rise of the parallel system run by bishops, about which, I mean, who knows, we have a lot of anecdotal information, which you know far better than I. We have a lot of anecdotal information about how heavily these were used. But I absolutely accept that, I mean, again, to use language I'm not sure I'm totally comfortable with, but that the services provided by government to people as opposed to really the government as extractors. The people exist in a somewhat different relationship to the government. the ways that we can do it. But earlier access to courts, there's a body of evidence that suggests Roman courts were actually quite heavily used.
So, one of the things I find just so striking with, especially the map you have up right now, is just how far inland and what I can't imagine is a military purposed network you've got there. Because it flies in the face of this narrative that I see in a lot of secondary things of Roman Empire trade is all naval, the roads are for the military, so on and so forth. And I'm wondering if that's where we get our isolated Anatolian village idea, that if it's not on the coast, it's not important, seems to be in the secondary scholarship. And this seems to fly straight in the face of that and say that the Romans do care about very deep inland and along the road networks that, I mean, if they're building a road network that deep into the mountains.
So about Anatolia, I'll venture a suggestion, and Anthony can accept it or refute it or modify it as he wishes. But and it arises out of some work I did some time ago. Actually, shared with Anthony once upon a time, and that is that it has to do with something like our indebtedness to an ancient imperial dynasty. And the simple version runs like this: that Greek literature in particular, right? That the sets of vocabularies, the sort of anthropology of Greek literature as it's applied to the Eastern Mediterranean, essentially recognizes as political populations that live in polis. In part, it has to do with the narrowness of a Greek political vocabulary in which these sets of terms, political, polis, politeus, and so on, are frankly all closely etymologically related. And so populations that don't live in polis, which are non-Greek, right, must be non-political, and their lives must be non-narratable. Right, they live commedon or scattered in villages and the like. Here there's a sort of interesting clash with that's visible and then gets effaced, I think, over time. But there's an initial period of a clash between a Roman vocabulary and a Greek one, because in very early documents from the province of Asia, directed from Greeks from the residents of the province of Asia, meaning the southwest coast of Turkey, to the Romans, they say things like the Greeks and the other people who live in Asia. Now, when the Romans write back, the Romans just use the word Greek to reply to all. It comes very rapidly in Roman governmental parlance to mean all non-Roman residents of a parliament. So a distinction that for the Greeks is just hugely important. Greeks and others, Greeks and barbarians, or whatever. The Romans are like, you're all Greek to us. But I think that, when the I mean, I'm not going to remember the exact terminology, but I'm sorry, I won't hazard a guess. But I do think that one of the reasons why the non-urbanized or unurbanized the unurbanized populations of Asia Minor are invisible is because of a set of what you might call non-propositional commitments, ontological commitments in the percipience and cognition of in particular, of Greek speakers. That is, it's embedded in Greek political vocabulary. That people who don't live in polis are essentially not perceived as having political life and therefore not subject to narration. And at that level, of course, some of the politics of monastic life in late antiquity are interesting, because of course one of the fundamental polarities motivating the geography in our term, in metaphoric geography of hagiographic literature, is the contrast between inhabited and uninhabited space. Right? So many of the original people we know practicing monastic forms of discipline lived in cemeteries. within 10 yards of a city, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to live far from a bakery. That would be sort of uncivilized, right? So the whole point of living in a cemetery was that it was by virtue of a taboo, uninhabited. Not that it was far from the city. It wasn't unurbanized. It was literally not open. Now I'm going to be corrected by.
No, not affected at all. Although communities could be different. But no, that wasn't what I was just thinking. I push that even further. That there's even a more profound problem with talking about the 85%. Is that we actually don't know where they lived. I mean, we have so little archaeological evidence that allows us to really say anything concretely about rural settlement patterns. There just hasn't been that. It's starting. I know Kim Bowes has been working on a project in Italy on this, and there's attempts to do it. But one of the going theories that she fancies about, which is interesting, is that, and she came to present here a couple of years ago, you might remember, is that in fact people aren't necessarily living in the countryside. They're temporarily staying there to work on their fields, and then they go back to the cities. And so, in point of fact, that the problem of the rural might in fact not be a problem if we think about much more mobile communities of people. And I mean, does that screw things up for you, or does that make it easier?
Oh no, I mean we have some descriptions in ancient literatures of people living in cities, right? And some of these are interesting. Some of these literatures are interesting because some of, as it were, the commitments of when I say some, as it were, the conceptual commitments that people make become visible at moments when, by virtue of legal or otherwise action, these things have to be disaggregated. So in the punishment of Capua, right? The Romans punished a city called Capua by forbidding them to have a government. But they say that the material infrastructure of the city has to remain because the people who are tired from the fields need somewhere to rest. Kim Bowes. And the notion that you can have an urbs, meaning a monumentalized core, that is not a civitas, works itself out in the literature and all sorts of things. It becomes a sort of test case for the Romans, like Panopeus in Pausanias. Panopeus is this odd little city in Greece, and this travel writer now named Pausanias says, everyone calls it a polis if I've been there. It's just this shithole. I mean, he said they have no buildings, they have no running water, there's this filthy stream that flows in the middle. How could this be called a polis? And the answer is that the surrounding cities call it a polis. But it is always, in modern literature, it is then always cited as the test case. It is the liminal case of just how filthy and run down could you be, and you're still a Greek city-state. And Capua, for ancient writers, is the liminal case in the Italian peninsula. The other thing I'd say is that it's phenomenally underexploited, which is to say, I know it's like no one ever discusses it, but we actually have an ancient catalog of the cities and villages of Italy. Right? And one of the interesting things about it is that it repeatedly refers to population centers that have become uninhabited. Right? It'll just say Evanston. No one lives there anymore. There's another very much smaller body of data that would interest somebody like Jim Scott, having to do with the levy, in which the Romans will say, in an actual historical narrative, it'll say something like, and we needed to raise an army, so we sent somebody to Gary to collect their contribution, and we couldn't find anyone. There we don't have any clue whether what was at stake was that really was Gary had become uninhabited, or somebody heard that the recruiting official was coming, and they just performed a temporary anaporesis, right? They just melted into the fields for a couple of days. But in this catalog, I mean, it's called the Book of Colonies, but it catalogs much more than colonies. We have the list of hundreds of towns, I mean, some of which are really quite insignificant, it must have been, and any number of which it says no one lives there anymore. So the demographic history of even the Italian peninsula, about which we know a lot, is, I think, very difficult.
I just wanted to add, after the 7th century, look a bit later, this question of the polis becomes rather obsolete. It wasn't for many centuries after that Byzantium developed something that we would call cities. Between more or less the 7th and the 11th or 12th centuries, it was largely a population of small farmers. And this was understood and recognized in the way in which the population was discussed in the sources. They did not really keep up the fiction of police. Though they might use the term sometimes, they were just referring to fortified settlements. This poses another interesting dimension because what Byzantium was trying to do most of that time was survive. And in order to do that, what it had to do was recruit. And this poses the problem of military recruitment as another way in which that 85% was tapped. And because if you just think about the sheer number of soldiers that Rome was maintaining, even at the height of the empire, but in relation to the population, even afterwards, even in the 11th century, if you're maintaining 250,000 people on the roll for an empire that has how many million, right? That's a large a percentage of the able-bodied young men, which means that, I mean, especially in the middle period, especially since their legal status was in part defined by their relationship to lands, the lands that are used to support them. This means that a large part of this rural population and their lands are basically ordered according to a law of persons that defines them as soldiers in relation to the state. And this is a network that, I mean, this includes their households. And if you do the math, you pretty much figure out that it's probably 1 out of 10, or something like that. Families must have been part of this, defined that way, and often actually bound to their land. That is, they had to cultivate it so that those lands are productive to support the soldiers. This is not the isolated Anatolian peasant. This just doesn't work. I mean, you simply cannot maintain those size armies that way.
About some of the stuff you were talking about, theory and terms and terminology. How much of this struggle is post-Enlightenment dichotomy between church and state, where the state is, we're willing to talk about a state to the extent that we perceive that it's irreligious, or that it's impersonal. So that's why maybe it's not, can't be a state if they're a patron. How much of this problem is kind of inherited from that kind of a dichotomy?
I don't know, but which problem exactly are you referring to?
What to call the Byzantine X, empire, state, and then also your gesture towards the Roman state, that kind of a problem. Maybe relevant too if we're talking about being a state. Does that, do we feel okay doing that? That kind of
Well, let me piggyback on this if I could. I mean, I think it's a sort of a friendly amendment, which is I wanted to sort of open things up. We're starting to open things up. Get a little teensy-weensy bit away from the specifics toward some general claims you're making. And so you're asking, well, what is it that defines the state? And I'm asking, what are the, in my mind, last 10 minutes, what are the essential features that one can, if we have a checklist, taxation, penetration into the countryside, military recruitment, court systems. I mean, what are the checklists that create? In this paper, you imply that there are real empires and real states, and then there's this sort of dross in the ancient world that doesn't qualify as not. These are not empires. They're aspirational. They're presumptive, but they really don't cut the mustard because they don't really have what it takes. And then the implication is broadly that if the Habermasian frame is or the bureaucratic state is modern, well, we had a modern world back here in the ancient world, but it's only the Mediterranean, it's only Rome. Well, I guess I want to ask, there are at least 2 other major circuits, global circuits, meaning China, Han domain, and actually Peru is not insignificant. It's worth at least. I wish we had some Mesoamericans to talk, or at least some Andeans to talk about these comparisons. We need to do that. To talk about how we think about what are the structures in the Han world, the Roman world, and the various iterations of empires in the Andes that all have similar, and even Teotihuacan, for example, in exactly the same kind of military empire. How many of these really are homologous what are the elements of homology that we see among these? And you suggested already, well, those Bronze Age entities are not empires; they are just not relevant. So how do we address this problem? What is the nature of state? And then we also have the other side of the matter, which is what happens so that the modern theorists look back and just see the piddly patrimonial state in the Middle Ages, looking from Oxford and Cambridge and Paris, where in fact the bureaucratic state did indeed break down.
But I think what I'm specifically wondering about is the question of religion.
Yeah, well, I was about to say there are the church is out there doing its thing, but
Right,
that's
it's
maybe
part
all
of
left.
part of our discomfort with maybe talking about a Byzantine state that if there's a perception that, well, there are still religious people who are running it, so but we have this split in our mind, so can we still call it a state? I think that's part of what I'm wondering about there, specifically that.
Oh yeah, no, that is that's definitely an element in the modern discussion of Byzantium. By the way, Byzantium is a modern term, right? It was coined in the 16th century, and it didn't really catch on until the 19th. This isn't even what Gibbon primarily calls it. Primarily calls it the Empire of Constantinople or the Empire of the Greeks, which are also modern terms. They're, well, I mean, they might have some Western medieval precedents, but anyway. So these are all terms, including empire, which is not a term that the Byzantines used or could have used because they used Latin, that have been made up. So the discussion is carried on largely in these made-up terms. If you look at the Byzantine evidence, they don't discuss whatever it is that's going on in those terms. But you're exactly right. One of the major criteria that enables modern scholars to say that Byzantium is not this and not that and not the other thing is because of its alleged theocratic nature. And so that there's this ideology that is sort of free-floating from any kind of particular, anything that we would, as a specific state, and that somehow the Byzantines have this universal, free-floating religious ideology about the emperor being governing in Christ's place and so forth. So the question really comes down to whether you think that is a viable historical model. Whether you can, I don't think you can. It's something that exists in the sources, but it occupies, I think, a particular type of sort of existential, role. I don't. It's not very helpful for understanding all the taxation and recruitment and so on. Anyway, so that's definitely a problem. By the way, I think this term state is very problematic. But this gets to John's.
I'd like to kind of open this out a bit, and still, you're all engaging with the questions of something that might be called the state. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with looking at a slightly more macro view of the place of this web of structure that we're calling a Roman state in comparative terms?
Well,
and ultimately, we're going to get to try to be theoretical too.
Sure. One question, and I can probably say a great deal more about the Andean case than the Chinese case if ultimately you want to do that, but let me just stick with Rome and its neighbors for just a second, right? If you were to try to make a distinction between ancient and early modern empire at the level of form, so I'll stay away from any attempt to quantify what we mean by intensive, penetration. Right? And you were to think about Persian, Arsacid, Sasanian, early Roman, and so on, rule over their neighbors. You would have to say, something like that ancient empire, up to a point this is true of Ottoman, governed through the, as I put it, through the cultivation and management of difference, right? That is far from having anything like an avowed imperial project in which they imagined universalizing metropolitan institutions, or for that matter, metropolitan culture, and it penetrating uniformly throughout the territory and deeply throughout the population. They generally came up with some set of categories, some single, some multiple set of categories in which to classify the population, usually separating it into geographic units. Often through a sort of imperial action in which you, regardless of what the people thought of themselves, you said, you will be the people of Ohio, you will be the people of Illinois, and so on. And then in ideologically motivated representations, like the tribute reliefs from Persepolis, or in the Roman case, through the depiction of individual populations on coins, you would endow these people with a particular cultural identity and, say, a form of dress and so on, that would differentiate them from the population next to them. And in the Roman case, where we happen to know, you would then additionally impose rules forbidding forms of social and economic exchange. You would forbid rights of intermarriage and the writing of private contract among the populations, so that any one of these populations would remain culturally, economically, and socially reaved from its neighbors and have exclusively bilateral relations with the metropole. So far from relying upon universalization as a project of the state, right? It remained an empire, and in particular an ancient empire, because you wanted them to remain, one, emphatically different from each other, and two, emphatically different from the center, right? So at the level of law, Romans would say, we want, that the Romans would not only essentially require these people to use their own laws, but the Romans would say you are forbidden to use Roman legal forms. Non-Roman citizens couldn't write a Roman will that would be valid in the Roman court. Now, if this is what the Romans thought an empire was, and this does look like an awful lot of ancient empires, as I say, including say, the Persian, the Arsacid, the Sasanian, and so on, and to a point, the Inca. Although, of course, for the Inca, we have source problems of a somewhat different nature. As we know a great deal about the unification of the empire through particular forms of ritual action, but ideological representations were somewhat harder access. And even where we know things about the sort of annual processions that went out to the four corners of the empire were dependent, of course, on colonial era sources. But if this is something like an ideal typical description of what an ancient empire was, that is, before you get to something like early modern Christian Europe, then surely at that moment, if not before, when in 212, the Romans extended citizenship uniformly to all residents of the empire, then by their own lights, they ceased to be whatever political form they were before and became something else. Now, part of the argument, I mean, and as you can imagine, a great deal of, one way to describe this is that, a great many empires, and the Romans would be like this, one of the effects of having an empire is that certain kinds of juridical distinction are sustained between metropolitan populations and others, and that a notional juridical equality obtains within the metropolitan population precisely in virtue of contradistinction to colonized subalterns. And frankly, that forms of social differentiation within the metropole are not perceived as having juridical salience precisely because you congratulate yourself on having subalterns. But if that's a description of how social difference within the metropolitan population at Rome was tolerated because you imagined yourself holding on to other people, it's not simply that the change in political form and the extension of citizenship to others changed their lives, if it did. It also presumably has ideological consequences for how people internal to the metropolitan population could think of themselves and their relations with each other. And a great deal of argument goes on about how many people were actually embraced by this change, what effects it might have had, how widely anyone in the provinces knew they'd been given Roman citizenship, blah, blah, blah. It's a long series of complicated questions with real evidentiary difficulty. But I think some sort of basic understanding has been hammered out. You'd like to think so. We've been only at Roman history for a couple hundred years. But to come back to my project, then a question arises. Well, so one question, but I won't get into that here. What new forms of social differentiation then intervened in the aftermath of the extension of citizenship? Because we cannot imagine, I think it would be idiotic to imagine, that all of a sudden everybody in the empire regarded themselves as equal before the law. That'd be stupid. I mean, obviously, some people were better than others, and we needed to find new ways to talk about that. So that's one of the things that happens, is that the minute you have a nutty emperor who says everyone's the same, somebody else has to come along and say, well, except for the fact that we're not, right? Various new, both at the level, of course, of social practice, but also before the law, new forms of difference need to be codified. But then the question is, what was it? Other than writing it off as the mad act of a mad emperor, which it possibly could have been, how was it that was this in fact a major revolution? Was it an insane act? The language that I've used to describe this transition from ancient empire to something else makes it sound like an enormous revolution. And to be sure, there are a fair amount of sources that describe what happened or that attest a change, but nothing that would arise to this level of revolution. So then the question would be, and the question I try to pose here is, are there forms of governmental action taking place before? Right? Are there forms of action that the Roman government is taking at the level of, among things, administrative law, like maintenance of roads, which help to promote cultural and social change in colonized populations, quite in spite of a principled position on the part of the Romans that the population should remain different. So perhaps one of the ironies, rather than insist that the Romans were engaged in a major project of Romanization, which was a sort of bête noire of Roman scholarship once upon a time, perhaps what you can say is that Roman government produced, so there's a space being carved out for profound cultural change as a result of actions of government that was not intended to produce cultural change, but can be quite accurately and precisely described as effects of governmental change, which helped to make what looks like a major revolution in the year 212 not a major revolution. I could come back to the broader, but I've talked for a while. So if you want, I can come back to the actual assembling theories about how we should describe these.
So the characteristic of that non-ancient empire or that non-ancient state is, in fact, some gesture toward universal citizenship. No, or not? I mean, you're saying you went back and forth on that. That was a very elaborate answer. My point being is that you gave us debate, which was 212, and then you pulled it back. Well, there's a great debate about this. But the implication here is that the essence of the paper is 212 is important. That the building of incorporation of citizens, the first half of the paper, and then the infrastructural homologies, roads, create this common platform that erases difference within the empire.
That's something I had the opposite, but in fact, 211 doesn't matter because you've already have these systems being built, and this process of interpolating local people into right that far predates. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you just write it differently, but I write it.
I'm just extrapolating.
That's right. Who's right? Me or John?
They're the thing to do when you say universal citizenship. I mean, they're the one question would be to wander off into comparative context. Now, I'm not. My knowledge of the history of the world sort of peters out around 500. But if you were to look at a whole series of early modern empires, which had avowed imperial projects towards producing cultural change and towards erasing forms of distinction, so long as the other people could be dragged in their direction. Even though, of course, in the case of some of these populations, like the Spanish world in the Americas, that what was at stake was not really getting indigenous populations, but Creole populations, various kinds of powers. It's perfectly clear that what solution that they hammered out, actually a kind of interesting document, was a constitution that would have created a situation of something like universal citizenship, right? I mean, that's what the Constitution of Cadiz was sort of producing. It came too late, so the whole thing went to hell in a handbasket anyhow. But one of the ways to think about the failures of at least some early modern empires, or early modern imperial forms, was that they created conditions under which this was a horizon of expectation for colonized populations, right? That, as I have described it about the Roman case, the justificatory rhetoric of the imperial project was, in their cases, avowedly organized around, and the legitimacy of their rule was organized around their claim that there was this horizon. And when it became clear that they weren't going to go there, the whole thing fell apart. Now, it could fall apart for a variety of reasons. In part because the metropolitan commitment to hang on to empire falls apart, because they also know that to hang on to empire in any legitimate way, right, they have to erase these juridical distinctions. They're not going to go there. Nobody. I mean, and as I say, what's one of the amazing things about many of these clashes in the modern world is nobody's actually seriously thinking about giving the Aymara populations Spanish citizenship. That may be a sort of odd, peculiar entailment of the Constitution of Cadiz, but they're actually just talking about giving, meaningful juridical participation to Creole populations. They're not going to do that.
Just to open up the maybe slightly different angle on the broader question of the nature of the beast, as it were. Thinking about the kind of power that we're talking about, you explicitly invoke Michael Mann early on in the paper and talk about his binary of despotic and infrastructural power. My first observation about that is that the two don't necessarily seem to be mutually exclusive, because despotic refers to the nature of the power being coercive, top-down. Infrastructural really refers to the mode of its delivery, as it were. So creating channels for it. And when we actually come to the situations you describe on the ground, the application of power, the practice of it, one could actually look at these processes, I think, in a more, dare I say, Foucauldian sort of an idiom, whereby this power, far from being despotic, actually seems productive, in the sense that we are producing not modern Western individuals, but Roman-type communities, conducting their conduct, as it were, in ways that ultimately induce them to be Roman. So I'm wondering if you'd just like to clarify a little the nature of the power that we're actually talking about, because I think this does have a bearing on the larger question of the nature of the beast.
Can I, before, I just want to throw out some other indices, because it's not just 212. I just want to toss out a whole number of just some statistics and facts and so on, just so that we understand that this is a long-term process. We're not thinking about one event. So, for instance, let's think about taxation. Less than a century after 212, Italy becomes subject to taxation just like any other province. Let's think about where emperors are coming from. All right, so until the 2nd century, they're mostly from Rome or from Roman colonies, eventually from Africa. Again, 100 years after 212, they're coming from all over the empire, from people who clearly could not claim to have had Roman ancestors. Right, let's think about statistics of where recruitment is done. We know that initially it's mostly in Italy, then it spreads to the provinces. Eventually, Roman armies are no longer really from Italy. So let's think also about when Greek authors use the first person plural, we, who does it refer to? The first case where this happens, and it refers to the Romans, is in the 2nd century. By the 4th century, it's everybody. When you say we, you do not mean Greeks, you mean Romans. All right? So these are just some indices of change that are part of a process. It's not because of one act. There's something going on. That's all. Anyway.
Well, I'm just going to throw out something that I've read in your literature, which is when people die in large numbers, you expand the franchise. You have Cypriot plagues, you have the Antioch plagues, and you have from what I've read, people saying we have to incorporate more people into citizenship because we don't have enough people to govern this place or these places. So I mean, I'm wondering about whether the entire Mediterranean is being shaped by waves of plague, and in fact, this universalizing is a giant jumble that's produced by the death of leading players. We talk about armies being no longer Roman. Yeah, no kidding. My position is that Rome is hollowed out, and part of the hollowing out is drawing in to maintain the structure, and you have to offer the benefits. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but that does put an historical process that maybe 212 is a marker of, but it certainly is a longer-term process that would be marked by successive waves of destructive impact of plague. But that's,
Well, and just to tag on that, I mean, it gets to I think what we've done so far is lay out the how, and that's what this does really well, is how this is happening, and what John just got to is the why. And I can think of two other reasons. I mean, plague is one, and immediately what I see here is this looks like Europe after the Black Death, right? You're trying to secure populations. You said the walls are trying to keep people in, not keep people out, right? I mean, that people are actually voting with their feet, right? You leave. The land, labor, capital, supply.
They don't know where to go.
Well, okay.
Rushing south of there would just be dead.
Well, yeah.
Finish up.
I
I have a.
But then there's two other, and that's sort of what I was looking for here is, number one, is this an external story? Are they doing this to extract more resources to then fight external wars? And then on the flip side, or is this an internal story? Are you obliterating people's local prerogatives or local identity? Because the problem really isn't external, it's that these internal generals just keep popping up everywhere. And so what you're trying to do here is making Rome, rather than pockets of places that then can be kind of used as a local force to fight these civil wars that are absolutely tearing apart the empire.
I want to
answer Greg's question.
Thank you.
one that I think is interesting to add to this question of the 3rd century franchise is there's a piece of epigraphy from North Jordan that is, here lies Julius Flavius, the full Roman name of someone who's a Roman citizen of the clan of Caracalla, the son of Abdugdos. And this is in northern Jordan, so middle of rural northern Jordan. So this is a very low-level person in the span of the empire. I think it's useful as an illustration of just how far down this goes.
Sure. One of the primary indices that people have used in attempts to assess what percentage of the population was non-Roman that was made Roman in 212 is trying to gather these figures. And that project is ongoing. There's a sort of a very, very, very clever guy at St. Andrews who's proposing an HRC project to do this, and I can describe how his method, which I think is actually really clever, but let me set that aside for a second. But I might come back to that in discussing John's point. So quickly, Foucault, man. Yeah, I agree. Although, and the trajectory that you detect in the paper is there, although because it was because I hit the deadline of 2 weeks in advance and clicked send before I wrote footnotes. There are a series of very precise lexical allusions to Foucault's work of 1978 in the last pages of the paper. So there is in fact a quite explicit trajectory for people who pay attention at that level.
29.
That move, right? That move from that starts with man and ends with Foucault. On the other hand, but about man himself, he does say, not in the Sources of Social Power, but in that piece from the Archive, in which the despotic and structural distinction is first worked out. Right, in that piece, he does have a little chronological chart in which he says ancient states had principally despotic power, no infrastructure, and the other. And part of my point was precisely to suggest that one of the ways in which the Romans actually managed to mobilize infrastructural power among non-Roman populations was, precisely by, perhaps in somewhat unexpected ways, commanding local populations to operate, to work in the service of the sustaining, building, constructing, and so on of Roman infrastructure. And then this had these further effects, right? That people come to describe themselves as, I'm the guy in charge of Roman roads, as if this is an interesting office. But apparently it was. So that's great. We can come back to that. But you're quite correct that that the story is ultimately a Foucauldian one, and part of the point at the beginning is precisely to lay out a set of analytic categories that I think that man describes as operating at some level in opposition, at least in the set of historical continua that the set of historical trajectories that he thinks of as slightly discontinuous. I would disagree with him.
Are you actually going to commit to the term governmentality at some point, or is that beyond the horizon here?
Oh no, absolutely.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I've written a pair of essays because I think of these political processes as ultimately occurring within specific linguistic systems. I mean, the book, the Roman Social Imaginaries book, is in part a book about I don't know what you wish to call it, depending on your affiliations, a work of metaphor and cognition, or you could call it a work of diachronic pragmatics, but it's a linguistically oriented book. And given this sort of theoretical affiliation on my part, I tend to think that people's ability to conceive of their own political identities occurs within specific languages. So I've written a pair of essays, one Latin, one Greek, trying to make the argument that of what Foucault would call, although he wouldn't say it could have occurred then, that a distinctive form of political subjectivity comes into being in the 2nd century of the Roman Empire, which is also a sort of theoretical claim that we'll come back to. Now, about the creation of citizens. It's at least possible, just to be charitable, it's at least possible that occasionally when they ran short of people, they created more people. But there doesn't seem to me any necessity that they did so. In part because the Romans maintained another army parallel to their own, composed of non-citizens. And for that matter, they tended to put the non-citizen units in the front lines, precisely so that they would die and the Roman soldiers would only have to fight once the enemy was tired. That's explicitly stated as a matter of principle. So creating more Romans is would just screw up that policy. So that's one thing. Two, one of the more interesting ways in which the Romans created new Romans is by instituting a system in which people elected to certain local offices would automatically get Roman citizenship as soon as they were finished their year in office. Now, this is interesting for a variety of reasons, but you should note, I mean, before I talk about why it's historically interesting in a broader comparative context, it's of course interesting because it's systematic, right? It's not tied to any specific event. We know that the Romans invented it in the early 1st century BCE, if not earlier, and that it operated widely across the entire Western Mediterranean. So there was a system for just creating new Roman citizens every year, year after year after year, across thousands of cities. Everybody who was elected to office became a Roman citizen automatically, over and over and over and over again. And their families became citizens, and they would produce more citizens. Now, it's been turned out to be very difficult to quantify just how big this effect was, but attempts are ongoing to do that. But that was not tied to a plague. Now, that's also interesting. I mean, it's worth it, but since we're talking in comparative terms, it's worth talking that A subverts a Roman principle, what looks to be a Roman principle, and it, of course, looks different than other empires, because notice what happens here. So, first of all, in the Roman context, there is a series of records from essentially around the time of Augustus, so around the turn of the millennium, referring to earlier Roman history. So we're here on shaky ground, because we don't know the extent to which these actually reflect something like the legalities of the legislative process of 200 years before. But it sure looks like the creation of new Roman citizens required legislation by the Roman people. That is to say that the citizen body had to vote, at least for large-scale incorporations. The citizen body had to vote to allow other people to join them. Right? But this system, which they set up, as I say, around the year 100 BCE, it's a bit murky, right, says that now, if you were Kautsky, you would just say, an aristocratic empire, right? We have local elites, we make them Roman citizens, we co-opt them in the service of Roman interests, we hope that there produces an alignment of their subjectivity, or at least of their self-interest with ours. Fine. Except that, right, in all of these cases, these are something like democracies created by Rome. Most ancient empires tried to impose democracies because democracies are easier to govern. The Persians certainly did. Most of the Greek cities of Ionia that we know of that had democracies, it was imposed by Persia. The Greeks had no instinct for democracy.
It's not in our modern sense, is it?
Yeah, sure. Or at least this is what Herodotus tells us. We can quarrel about whether he's correct. But these are, right, these are elections among populations of aliens, right? And they're not. Hang on. I know you've been agitating the protest, but let me finish the sentence. Then you can tear it apart, right? But so far as we know, what was in fact going on is the Romans told municipalities composed of aliens that they should organize themselves along democratic lines. One, they should elect whomever they wished according to local systems of social differentiation. Two, and that whoever is regarded as an elite by aliens and created as an elite through alien elections conducted among aliens would then immediately become a Roman citizen de jure. Right? So we go from a moment when it looks like the Romans are saying only we are authorized to admit other people to our group, to let them into our sandbox, to saying anyone outside the sandbox can push someone into the sandbox. It's a remarkable thing. Nothing like it exists in any other empire that I know, at least at that systematic level. And finally, just about the issue of Roman, non-Roman, right? I would be really interested to know if anybody could vindicate the claim that the Romans thought in racial terms. Apart from Greeks. So here's one way to cash this out. But I could go on in some like, let me just offer you a quick illustration. Right? The Romans have no term that means Romanness. Right? Romanitas. This is a creation of North African Christianity at the end of the 2nd century. Right? Does this mean that the Romans had no concept that people internal to the population shared something? No. I mean, I suggest, and I could argue about this at some length, that the term in fact was civitas. But what the Romans shared was, it was a highly contractarian political system. What they shared was a shared commitment or a shared assent to a particular normative order and nothing else. Absolutely nothing else. Right? Two, in consequence of that, and the Roman myth of asylum speaks to this, that people who themselves assented to be bound by Roman law were Romans. It had nothing to do with descent. All you had to do was say, yes, I will be bound by those laws. You were Roman. That was all it took. It was not descent, it was not cuisine, it was not accent. Three, if you want an illustration of difference, right? The Roman term civitas, right? Means, as we've already said about Augustine, and maybe that was at lunch, right? The Roman term civitas is an abstraction from civis. It means something like citizen. Citizenship, right? It's a juridical quality. But by metonymy, it can also mean city, as it happens. It can also mean territory in which you reside, but it can also mean populace. It can also mean citizen body. So that the juridical abstraction maps the people. The term politeia, which can also mean something like constitution, or something like this. Does politeia as a metonym refer to the demos? No, because juridical descriptions of membership in the Greek world are epiphenomenal to the thing that really defined membership, which was descent. Juridical law comes later, right? But for the Romans, law was everything. Dissent meant nothing. They were continuously in the process of creating new Romans. It is, I mean, if it wasn't for the fact that occasionally you find texts like this, in which there is a foreign patronymic, how would you know? How would you know? Did the Romans themselves talk about this? I mean, you know, there must have been, I mean, we have a handful of texts in which the Romans reflect on the non-Roman origins of Roman citizens. But it must have been, by a certain point, a majority. A whopping great majority of them. I mean, every now and then they joke about local accents. Like, so-and-so has a North African accent. But they say that, I mean, we did, and you could say that the Romans didn't like the Spaniards because they had these crazy Spanish accents. But in the one case where I can think of such a joke being made, it's actually of a Roman whose family moved to Spain and then resided there and he came back. And he happened to have been the emperor.
What about something like juvenile anti-Egypt stuff? Because that's the specific one I can think of that's
And right, the prejudice attributed to Augustus in Dio at the end of describing the possibly real, possibly fictional fourth role in his will, in which he says, "Don't create more citizens because less you taint it." But there he's talking, of course, about slaves, isn't it? I'm not saying I said they're a handful. They're a handful. But compared to what we can think of as the systematic nature of the phenomenon of the creation of citizens from aliens, it's a pretty amazing thing. And other ancient populations comment on it. It's not just to say moderns, right? Other ancient populations say, Romans are effing weird.
Yeah. I mean, to use the map like that, I mean, in Apologia, you have I've been accused of being half Gaetulian, half Numidian, and that we can try and reconstruct that. And he said basically it doesn't matter where you're born. We're not like produce, where there's good wine from this place or good wine from this place. It matters where your immortal soul is, you know, this kind of stuff. But we reconstruct from Apuleius' statement there that there was an accusation somehow against his borderline hybrid identity.
And you know, as I say, there are jokes about Hicks, right? Just that anyone from anywhere outside Rome. I mean, there's always a sort of metropolitan prejudice. There's an urban-rural prejudice, which would have played into this Apuleius. I mean, the Gaetulians were classic non-urbanized populations and so on. So there's all sorts. There are many different kinds of prejudices. I'm not done. The Romans had no commitment to egalitarianism by any stretch of the imagination, but racial thought generally didn't play a role in it. Oh wait, you had a.
Oh, I mean, I just want to know why they did it. I mean, what's sort of the. I mean, I think Tina kind of got to it too. I mean, this is.
There's a very interesting problem. So that one is that and here we come into a sort of different part of my life, arguing with the contemporary Neo-Romans, with the Pettits and Skinners of this world. Because so far as one can tell, I mean, if you look at, and here the evidence is just really horrible, but so far as you can tell in the early Roman Republic, citizenship was an instrument of control. It wasn't a package of rights that you gave to people. That if you look, conquered populations received citizenship at the moment of conquest, and their lands were seized as well known. Right? So that, right? No, to put it bluntly, things that were Roman were things that were controlled. And you released things that you released as non-Roman things that you did not wish to govern. So the originally Republican citizenship was merely an instrument of empire. It had nothing to do with being nice to people. So in records of the early and early Middle Republic, to the extent that they can be believed, at the end of a war, the people you beat were made Roman citizens, and your allies were released as aliens.
So is this sort of Clausewitz, citizenship is war by other means or something?
So yeah, but citizenship does come to mean, but the periodization is extremely complicated. Citizenship does come to be a privilege. So one of the puzzles about Roman citizenship would then be that we have the Romans themselves write in their own histories records of people who decline. The Romans will say, "Would you like to be a Roman?" They say, "No, thank you." And at some point, that peters out. There's a moment around the year 100 BCE where I can think of no instance afterwards in which someone declines Roman citizenship. But I mean, I could be wrong. And exactly what that means as a moment of transition, I don't know. But it's perfectly clear that early on citizenship is not a privilege.
So is that a form of resistance then?
What?
To decline Roman citizenship?
I mean, there, of course, what we have are descriptions of by aliens, and what they're saying, what they often say is we want to preserve our own laws.
So is that an act of resistance?
I don't know if resistance. I mean, they're offered it, and they say no. I'm not sure if that's resistance.
Well, it's a maintenance of autonomy rather than resistance implies internalization, already internalized, but autonomy. We should begin to think about moving toward wrapping things up. So why don't we have 1 or 2 more questions?
That's like 20 more minutes to me. Begin to think about.
But no, maybe I'm being polite. Well, we need to call. I know Anthony has hit the road in a few minutes, and we are at least 10 minutes over our allotted time. So let's take 1 or 2 final pressing points. I see a final pressing point.
We have a no on stage left.
So I'm going to parrot his question and say, well, why do they do this? Except, why did indigenous populations or provincial populations agree to become municipia? Why did they adopt? If we look at the Flavian Municipal Act, this is a pretty rigid change to their local lives because they adopt a whole Roman code. And at the end of it, they say, whatever isn't specifically mentioned in this constitution will be decided by Roman traditions or Roman laws. So why, in your best guess, do local populations agree to these terms before the Flavian municipalization? So why do we see municipia spring up?
On some continuum between cynical self-interest and their having bought into having been seduced by the sort of, as it were, aesthetics of Roman power. I don't think it's possible nowadays, right? The evidence wouldn't permit you to choose between those or select somewhere between them. Yeah, I'm not trying to better answer. I mean, I could discuss for you why I might think we might tend in one direction rather than the other, but it'd be a complicated answer. I've given lots of long answers.
I'm going to jump in before somebody speaks before me. Early in the paper, you say that this paper launches a project intended to call into question many distinctions drawn in literature by way of supposition and rarely subjected to empirical verification. And I guess I have more of a methodological question, like, do you think that this is something that could be empirically verified, and how? And then also, like, we're kind of hinting at replacing man with some kind of pseudo-Poean theory, or do you have another theoretical approach, or are you just wanting to poke holes and hope other people come up with theories?
I suppose one way to answer that by way of not quite evading the question is that I'm an historian of the Roman world, and you could put it with a sort of deliberate epistemological naivete and say, to explain what I see, or to put it in a somewhat, I think, more appropriate fashion, I've been conditioned by the sort of world in which I was formed intellectually to recognize certain features of the Roman world. They emerge to salient and they demand explanations of a certain kind when I look at them. And the explanations I bring to bear and the interest that I have in the Roman world arise, I suppose, out of these intellectual currents, and I name some things that I have read and thought about a good deal over the last 20, 25 years or something like this. They have to do with questions like the nature of the state, for example, the nature of social power. Now, then the question will become, and it's a question I suppose all historians face, and everyone who would work, as it were, something like metaphorically across linguistic and cultural systems, about how to manage things like fit, right? Think about, it's probably useful here to think about metaphor, about the nature, as Anthony says, these aren't the words that they use to describe their own activity. But even if you were to do something idiotic, like try to write a history of the Byzantine Empire in Middle Byzantine, that would be, no, seriously, right? That would be, as it were, a reductio ad absurdum of this claim, but you wouldn't actually be able to do it. That would be epistemologically idiotic to say that you were, just because you were aping the language, that you were actually using their terms. And besides, if you succeeded, you would explain nothing. Why not just read some stupid Middle Byzantine text? But that's to imagine that you can actually exist within the ideological and conceptual horizons of your objects of study, which is different than. Hang on, Anthony. So I'll set that. Then but then the question becomes, right? There's a sort of what you might describe as a sort of recursive problem. That the kinds of, as Anthony said, and as Greg has said in his work, and as that the apparatus that we have available to us today, at least the dominant models of the state that we have available to us today, not only arose out of considerations of the modern world, they often make quite specific claims about their suitability or their appropriateness to modernity and they perform acts of distinction between modernity, or they assert distinction between modernity and whatever came before. So then, to return to the problem of the language of fit, right? To the extent that I claim and successfully vindicate the claim, I'm not sure anyone believes that I have, but right, to the extent that you believe that you've actually explained something about the ancient world in light of these theories, right? The better the fit turns out to be, right? The more you call into question, not perhaps the hermeneutic utility of the theory, but the embedded claim within some of these theories. It's really explicit in Koselleck and Foucault and Habermas, but you could say the same about some of the others, right? That you call into question their claim that what they're explaining is something specific to modernity, which is not to say that somehow the world circa 1789 and later, or the world post-1870, or whatever you want to date the foundation of international law, or whatever, is not somehow different. But I'm not sure that they have successfully explained the difference. I'm not sure they have successfully explained the difference precisely in the domain, namely the political form. I'm not sure they've successfully explained the difference precisely in the domain in which they claim to be able to do it. But my job doesn't go. My job extends to the Roman Empire.
I think that is a great call.